good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever, almost good night for some people I know. So it's wonderful to see you all, and thanks for joining this session. It's of the Elders Council. We think that this is really a very, very important topic about money. And we're absolutely delighted to have Mark with us to talk about this, because it's something he's focused on for so long. I first met Mark when he was an advisor at Ashoka, and really I was very struck in the very first place that he had such a focus and an appropriate focus on money. And so many of us in social enterprise think about money, but it's usually from a fundraising point of view. How are we going to raise the money to get the work done? And we so rarely think about its impact on us as individuals, about the succession and transition through our own organizations. And it's real kind of having a really much more sophisticated view of finance and the economics of personal care and organizational care because of money. So I'd love to now introduce Mark, who's going to introduce himself and where his particular point of view at this time. So over to you, Mark. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really thrilled to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, and Mel and Chris and the whole Elders Council. It's such a pleasure to be back and speaking with you. Just very quickly, I've been an advisor at Ashoka since 2008. So, and my particular role at Ashoka, at the Network of Social Entrepreneurs, was originally to help social entrepreneurs and the founders of social sector organizations to raise capital. And so over many years, I've been advising and supporting founders of startups in raising capital, and that's what I continue to do to this day. And so more recently, I launched an organization of my own called Social Innovation Circle, which is very much around supporting founders throughout their entire journey, not just the raising capital piece, but also the building of the organization, and also their own personal career trajectories as well, as they transition through these various phases and go on to create impact in different ways. And so this topic, which we're going to talk about today, is very, very close to my heart and to the communities that I'm working with. And so it's a real pleasure to be invited to come and present on this topic today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I'll just echo Andrea and Chris's view about how pleased we are to have you on board, and your experience and expertise in this space is really important, because it's that part that we all tend to forget, looking after ourselves or thinking about our own career paths and so on, which is so actually vital to our own well-being. The title of the topic today is Living to Work or Working to Live, which is something we came up with because we know how passionate social entrepreneurs are about changing the world in the areas that they're working in, but don't necessarily think about themselves. So I'm going to hand over to you, Mark, just now, and then Mark and I are going to get involved throughout in the next period. A chat amongst ourselves. I'll ask Mark some questions after he's finished his presentations, and then keen to hear from everybody. At the same time, please put questions in the chat or points you want to make at any point, and we'll come back to you. But in the first instance, as I say, delighted you're here, Mark. Really looking forward to hear what you've got to say. On you go.
Okay, fantastic. So I prepared some remarks. Really, they're just sort of talking points for us to discuss. So I'm going to go for about 15 minutes, maybe just slightly over that. As I speak, please feel free to put lots and lots of questions into the chat, and we'll respond to them. And I think Andrea and Mel and Chris, feel free to just jump in as I go at various points along. There's really no need for this to be a long speech. So I think we're going to talk about some issues that I think all of us are quite familiar with, and I think will resonate with the audience. But I'm also very curious to hear people's experience on this call as well. So just to give you a bit of background, so I've been working with social enterprise leaders for over 15 years now, initially both at Ashoka, my own organization, which is called Social Innovation Circle, and a number of other organizations that I volunteered with and been part of. And my journey has very much come to this from the capital side. So I've been an investor in organizations, and I've invested personally in over about 60 organizations over that period of time. And as an investor into organizations, you get to meet CEOs and have conversations with founders, at a very, a very intense level in many ways, because you're with them when they're raising capital, you're with them when the organization hits the rocks, you're with them when they make some of the toughest decisions they have to make as leaders, and so I've been privileged really to observe many outstanding founders of social sector organizations, and been able to mentor them and coach and support them in different ways. And one of the things that I've observed again and again is that often social entrepreneurs, frankly, end up sacrificing themselves for the sake of their own organization. And it's a pattern that we see a lot, and it's not a healthy pattern, and it's not a good one, right? But perhaps it's not surprising. I mean, if you are a social entrepreneur, you're a person who's driven by a mission. You probably have very high levels of compassion, and naturally, what you most care about is doing good in the world or making impact in the world. And I think one of the very unfortunate things that happens as a result of that is that very often that comes aligned with what we might call a martyr complex in the sector, which not only is a natural predilection of many founders, particularly in the social sector, driven by a cause, but unfortunately that we have allowed in this sector to become encouraged and almost institutionalized. And that's where I think it becomes unhealthy. So what do I mean by the martyr complex? Well, I mean, let me know if listening to me whether this resonates or not. But what things that I've observed, founders of social enterprises and social organizations, they are very often the first people to cut their own salary when times get tough. They very often pay themselves last, when worrying about payroll, and will be the first to skip salary when there's a cash crunch. Very often, the CEO is not the highest paid member of the organization. Very often that they are paying other employees a lot more than themselves because they see those employees as being the crucial people that they have to keep. Very often they're not contributing enough towards a pension, so they're not planning for their own retirement and so on, and so it's unfortunate, but many of the founders that I've worked with end up being a martyr to their own cause, to their own organization. And as a result of that, many of them will often, in the later years, they'll be approaching retirement with a sense of dread, and a sense often, frankly, of being trapped. Many of them are forced to stay on longer than they would otherwise like, because they don't have the financial means to support themselves otherwise, and when they do want to move on. And that's not healthy for them, and it's not healthy for their organizations they lead. I've seen quite a few founders launch businesses alongside their NGO as a way to generate extra income for themselves and become more sustainable as an organization, perhaps pay themselves more as well. I've seen them, attracted, later stage to for-profit businesses because frankly they pay better, and there's less of a culture of having to wear the hair shirt all the time and be paid pennies and so on. And I think that's fine as long as the business they create actually makes sense and supports the organization, but in many cases it doesn't. In many cases it's actually not the right thing to do. But you do see founders who launch organizations and businesses because they don't find enough revenue, frankly, from the charitable side or from the NGO side. And so I think that we as a sector need to pay attention to this problem, because we do find many of our best and our brightest trapped, particularly at the end of their careers in quiet desperation. And I don't think that's a healthy thing. So as a as an investor in founders, as somebody myself who's seen quite a number of friends and close mentees wrestle with these issues and go through these issues, I think it behooves us as a sector to name this, recognize it, and actually try and find ways to get around, to improve on this situation. So that's what I want to do in the course of this talk. And I see in the chat already that there's a couple of people for whom this resonates. Andrea, I think you mentioning that this idea of being trapped or being a martyr to the cause is something which you've seen, right? And absolutely, it's I think it's an endemic problem actually for us in this sector. So how can we address this? How can we try and help founders through this? Is there any way? Any mechanisms that we can come up with to improve this? And I actually think there are. And the way that I would like to sort of frame this is, let's look at what happens in the private sector, because for some reason this doesn't seem to be occurring to nearly the same extent in the private sector. So what is it that the private sector is doing right that the social sector is doing wrong, or that is not picking up on, or culturally is not reflecting in some way? And so I again, I invest in a lot of for-profit social entrepreneurs and work with a lot of them as coaches and mentees. And many of them tell me that actually they almost feel a great sense of relief when they migrate from the NGO world into the for-profit commercial social enterprise world, or even purely into the commercial world, and move over into that space. Culturally, it seems to be more appropriate, or at least more recognized, that founders who spent their lives building organizations deserve some kind of reward for that and some kind of support for that. So what is it that the private sector is doing differently that the social sector is not doing? And I think there are three things that leap out at me as being fundamentally very different between private sector businesses and social sector organizations, even social sector enterprises, in fact. So what are those three things? Well, number one, in the commercial world, we have this concept of equity. And what equity means in the commercial world essentially is ownership in a business, right? So founders of private sector startups, from day one, they are owners of their own business. They have shares in their own business. And often those shares are the result of them, working for zero in the first few months or even first few years, putting in what is called sweat equity into their startup, which is a recognized concept in the commercial world. And it's recognized that if you are the founder who is doing that and working for very little, in the early days, or even putting in your own capital, even putting in your own money, then there should be a recognition of that. And the recognition of that is shares in your business, which you can then sell when you exit the business, right? And you can sell those shares to a new owner, you can retire with those shares can be bought back from your organization and so on. So there is this idea in the commercial world that founders have shares and are recognized for what they've done in building an organization. And of course they should be paid for it when they exit, so they sell their shares back to the company or they sell them to a new owner. And they receive that monetary reward at that time. Now, we don't have that equivalent in the NGO world or in the nonprofit sector. You can't own shares because there are no shares. It's not a share owning business, right? So my question, something which I've been thinking about and wrestling with for the last couple of years is it not time that we created some kind of alternative ownership mechanism for social enterprise, which improves on the status quo of nonprofits, which is you can't have any ownership, you can't have any monetary reward, you can't be recognized for what you've done in the early years, right? Which sits between the nonprofit and the for-profit. You own shares in the business and you are the owner of that business. And one of the very interesting areas that we've seen developments in this space has actually been in the area of digital technology. So, for example, we're hearing stories now about the thing which we call Web 3.0, right? Which is this idea of the new internet economy is going to be driven by organizations that are able to offer tokens and to their founders and to their community members, and that these tokens can be monetized in different ways, right? So that you can have some kind of monetization of that without necessarily having ownership, as you might do in a traditional for-profit business. So, there are people on this call who are a lot more familiar with this than me, but my sense is that the impact sector is converging very rapidly with the technology sector, which is inventing all kinds of creative ways in order to create monetary recognition and reward for owners and founders and community members in different ways, in order to be able to reflect their contribution to the organizations that they help build and to the systems they help support. And so I could imagine an impact economy driven by impact-led decentralized organizations issuing their own tokens, which could be monetized in different ways, an impact coin, if you will, which I think could be the next generation of philanthropy and the way in which these organizations could evolve. And so I just want to just plant that there as a thought. I don't think we've got time to dive into this too far, but my sense is that there will be a new generation of impact entrepreneurs who will not be running nonprofits and who won't be running traditional for-profit businesses. They'll be launching these new Web 3.0 type organizations, and they'll be monetizing it through tokens. And it'd be very, very interesting to see how that evolves. But that is a ray of hope, seems to me, in this sector. But there are two. Yeah, Mel,
just before you go on, Mark,
yeah.
Thanks. That's really fascinating, and I think without delving into the kind of mechanisms of a whole lot, how that might work, but thinking like that, I think is very, very helpful, because it starts you thinking about practically how can this challenge that we have be addressed. I guess one of the questions I have, though, related to that, and back to your martyr culture comment, which I think is very real, by the way, absolutely real. I think all of us kind of have had experience of that or know people who have. Is it the system that's the problem rather than the individuals that come in? So I certainly didn't start off being a martyr, and I don't suspect any of us did, but maybe we became them. Isn't it the culture that makes us all become beggars, if you like, in this sector, that we have to go around with a begging bowl for funds to keep our organization going? And often people kind of say, oh, people in the sector shouldn't be paid at all because they should be doing it because they're martyrs. Is it the system that's turning us all into martyrs, or do we have an actual predilection to it? So do we have a DNA to be martyrs anyway, given that we are determined, we want to build movements and create causes?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Mel. I think it's a combination of both. I think that the sector naturally brings people in who, are very driven for a cause and are willing to give up a lot for that cause, and who put the cause first and foremost. And I think that that has led to an institutionalization of this, and has therefore led to a culture of practices that I think are unhealthy. And we can draw upon, we can point to some of those, those facets. The idea that nobody in the social sector should be well paid, for example, is a very, very common feature. How many times have we heard, people say, oh, it's outrageous that this person should earn a six-figure salary, in the social sector, and we're talking here about the head of a multi $100 million organization operating in 25 countries, impacting tens of millions of people, and yet they think that nobody thinks that they should be paid the same as a junior ranking executive in an oil company. I mean, it's outrageous. It seems to me that is the case, but it's very, very common. So there is a culture around low pay, no question about that. There's a culture around, in the nonprofit sector, if you build up any kind of reserves, that's viewed with great suspicion. Why have you not distributed all this cash that you've got? And then guess what? You hit a rainy day, and suddenly the organization is on its knees, right? Because it hasn't even built up the kind of reserves that any prudent commercial organization would have been insisted upon by their investors to have. Right, but how many of us build up a 6-month cash cushion only to be told by funders that's too much, or that 10% of the margin has now gone, into overhead, and that's a problem. So I think there are these institutional and cultural issues, and I think that's something which we have to address.
So looking at new ways forward, I totally agree with you. Looking at new way forwards, as you suggest, really interesting. I see Andrea's got her hand up. Are you wanting to come in, Andrea?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mel. I'm just wondering, Mark, if you think our job is to educate donors, philanthropists and grant givers and so on into the fact that what you're talking about plays very well alongside the well-being movement that people are talking about in terms of how they feel spiritually and mentally, but that it's not easy to feel well if you're worried about money and that you're really being expected to survive on what you might call psychic wages, something, you've done a good thing, so all you get back is feeling good about something rather than some money. But you just wonder if philanthropists and grant givers, we could start to talk to them about the well-being of the individual, but the well-being long-term, the longevity of an organization that has built an exit strategy for a founder, a CEO. And I just wonder what your comments might be on that.
Well, it's absolutely a great one. And as somebody who sort of sits between the for-profit world and the social sector and moves between the two, one of the things that always strikes me is the cultural gulf between funders on the social side and on the commercial side. So when I speak to VCs or when I present a project to venture capitalists or to more commercially minded investors, right, we always have the conversation about how can we get the best CEO, and that means paying for it, right? And there is this sense of, we've got to make sure, of course, you've got to pay appropriately and make sure the CEO is supported in that role, and that this is a very, very important thing, and that and of course, if that person has built an incredible organization, and we want to get that person into this job, then that we have to pay the market rate, and the market rate is very competitive, right? And so that's number one. Secondly, conversations all the time around succession or around the expectation that somebody is going to want to move, or doesn't have to be in one place, forever, and so on. So I think it's in some ways it's a better conversation to be had, and it always strikes me that's missing, in this sector. And Christy just raised a great point on the chat. Good governance, right? It is not good governance to have a CEO who is not supported, or a senior management team that is not, is not feeling secure, right? And so I think there is a whole conversation to be had around funders about what really makes sense for the long term for the organization. And I think it absolutely speaks to the heart of it. Well-being is critical in that as well. Absolutely, yes.
Brilliant. This is a great conversation, but you had another couple of points you wanted to bring up, Mark. So
yes. So I had 3 ideas I wanted to put on the table and really just open up for discussion. My first was equity. Can we reimagine ownership or participation or contribution for the social sector in a way that gives founders some kind of equivalent to what venture capitalist founders get, which is equity, in their organization? And can we tap into the creativity of cooperative models and other models, powered perhaps by the token economy, in order to be able to do more of that? And so that's number one. And I think we can definitely explore that, because I think there's some really creative ideas coming out. And I also see a convergence between the cooperative conversations of 10, 15 years ago and the kind of the new sort of Web 3.0 type communities that are now evolving as well. I think Web 3.0 is the natural successor, in fact, to the cooperative movements of previous decades. But that is still some while off, and that may be a little bit sort of, out there at the moment. But so I think there are 2 other major areas where we can directly today borrow on the norms and conventions of the private sector. And one of those is frankly private pensions, right? So, you know, in the private sector, founders and senior staff, they contribute towards a private pension, and the government will typically contribute and match that, and the company itself will often match those contributions as well. So very few social sector startups are able to offer anything like that, right? If many don't even offer a private pension, let alone match contributions in order to sort of, you know, make it more attractive for the individual. So I think that this is where the social sector, the funders, could have a role in stepping up. So, you know, my organization, Ashoka, other organizations like the Skoll Foundation, for example, for decades have been providing grant funding to founders, right? But what they've been doing is they've been providing that grant funding to them at the beginning of their career, right? When they're launching the organization. And I'm just wondering whether there isn't also a need for funding that comes in that form, but at the end of a career, in order to help a founder to successfully transition and set up their organization for success and for legacy going forward. So, you know, I'm imagining, for example, could there be something like retirement grants as well as, you know, startup grants that could be set up to recognize somebody at the end of an illustrious and celebrated career, but also give them funding to be able to set themselves up and create a successful organization that can maintain after they've gone, find a successor and so on. And then enable that person to perhaps sell their services back to the organization in the form of consultancy or advice, but not having them necessarily in the CEO seat, where, you know, which carries a lot of baggage with it. So, you know, is there an opportunity for some kind of equivalent of the startup grant, but at the end of you know, career trajectory? That's one question I want to put out there. Another question is, could we actually create some kind of social entrepreneurs pension fund, maybe funded by government, maybe funded by wealthy donors and philanthropists, in order to be able to provide the equivalent of a private sector pension, you know? And maybe it doesn't have to be a 1-for-1 match. Maybe it could be a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1. Why not be even more generous? You know, recognizing, for example, people who you know, are celebrated founders and social entrepreneurs over many years, you know, have surely contributed more than enough, you know, in terms of impact, and have now accumulated tremendous knowledge which they can share. You know, can they not be eligible for some kind of entrepreneurs retirement fund or pension fund that would come in and support them? And this is a question I think that, you know, organizations like Nesta and others should I think be thinking very seriously about, because I think that would provide enormous value to the sector, you know, both helping organizations be set up for success, helping founders to transition, and also just frankly just taking some of the weight off the shoulders of the CEOs as they approach, you know, those later years, when they should really be at their best and you know and contributing as much as possible. And then my final comparison with the private sector is what happens around directorships and trusteeships, right? So successful executives typically have a very spend their final years or their final decade or so, or 2 decades, joining the boards of other organizations and becoming directors of other organizations, and they get paid handsomely for doing so. And rightly so, because they are the experts. They are the ones who have the most experience, have been doing this for the longest. And it would be a pity for that knowledge to be in just one organization, the one that they founded. Why not take that expertise at that point and spread it across many other organizations that could really benefit from that, right? Well, the private sector recognizes this, and it has a mechanism for doing this, which is board seats, right? Executive directorships and so on, and it pays for that. But in the charity sector, for some bizarre reason, we don't do that. We're uncomfortable with that. You know, in the UK, you're not allowed to be paid as a trustee, right? You know, out of some, again, this martyrdom complex, you know, this culture that we spoke about earlier of this should all be for free, you know. And what a waste of talent and opportunity that is, right? A waste of the people who have that knowledge and you know and don't get an opportunity to spread it, and a waste for all the organizations that would benefit so much from the CEOs and founders being able to do that, if only that they could be compensated for their time, but also for their expertise in doing that. So my question, why don't we do this in the social sector? I mean, it seems to me crazy that we don't. But I do think that even if we can't pay trustees, which, something which again I think is absurd. What about the idea of other organizations stepping up and going, well, why don't we create a paid consultancy program for senior entrepreneurs, senior founders, to be able to liberate themselves from their organizations and then go and spread their knowledge, in this way. Again, tremendously valuable for the sector. Are there philanthropists who should pay for that or be willing to support that? I think so. Are there governments that should actually create some kind of elders board that could, that could pay for these services as expert advisors to other organizations? I think it could be extremely helpful. So I would love to see whether a culture of that kind of senior directorship could be fostered. I mean, the ideal situation would be to let charities and NGOs pay for high quality, experienced individuals. But if as a first approximation, if that can't be done, can we at least create a proxy where we can fund people to be paid as advisors and consultants to doing this? So again, I've seen a number of my investees and coach, people that I've coached go on after their organization to become paid advisors to several organizations, as well as joining the speaker circuit and becoming paid coaches themselves. Chris, I know that's something which you yourself do very successfully and have been able to do for yourself. Can we institutionalize that for the broader sector to make it easier to do that? I mean, again, just taking an example from the private sector, just think about what happens when you're the retired CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You get paid thousands of dollars to become a speaker and to give speeches and to go on the circuit, right? And to go and do that. Universities will pay you to become a lecturer and again, share your wisdom. You join the boards of other companies and you get paid for doing that. And so, the private sector does this really well. It recognizes people for their skills and their talent and their experience, and it rewards them in multiple different ways for doing that. Why don't we do that in the social enterprise sector? We should. And so I think that is, so this idea of creating directorships, paid advisory roles, institutionalizing that in some way is something which I think the social sector desperately needs if it is to unlock these bottlenecks. And so those are my 3 ideas, my starters for 10. Some kind of equity type structure. The idea of a pension fund for social entrepreneurs or pension mechanisms that could be created. And finally, this idea of directorships and recognizing people for their experience in those later stages. So let me stop there and hand back to Mel or Chris, and really happy to have a conversation around these 3 issues.
Yeah, so Mark, thanks for that. That's really, really constructive as ever, practical, stimulating. And I think just looking at the chat, lots of people saying that those were really good ideas. And I certainly agree with that in each of those 3 areas, good ideas to actually investigate. Maybe a question to you then is, okay, if these are good ideas, what's the next steps then, Mark, for us here? We're all social entrepreneurs and can-do people, and some of us at the end of our careers, if we want to call it that. How do we move this forward? Ideas like creating retirement funds or setting up senior consultancies that you mentioned, etc. How do we do that? And how do we begin to change? You mentioned in the UK where I'm based, the rules are that in charity sector trustees don't get paid, so we would have to change government. How do we begin this story and get some of the ideas actually happening?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to defer to a lot of people on this call who are a lot more experienced than me on this issue. I mean, a couple of ideas that I've got, I think it requires conversation with government and policymakers, because I think there are some policy dimensions to what I've just said, particularly around the rules on being paid trustees, that would be interesting to explore. I think that a natural constituency for this are the people who are setting up these kind of large government funds to promote social enterprise and this kind of sector. So Mel, in the UK, I think the natural people to have the conversation with would be people like Big Society Capital, for example, which has got substantial funds and was set up by the government precisely to improve the efficiency and operations of the social enterprise sector. The Access Foundation, Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, all of those are very well placed. I think that organizations like Ashoka and Skoll would obviously be natural partners in something like this. Speaking as an advisor at Ashoka, I mean, Ashoka was quite revolutionary in its early years because it was giving stipends and grants to founders without any restrictions at all. And I think that was very, very important in kind of catalyzing the startup kind of grant movement, right? And getting that going. I think what we're talking about now is transition grants at end of career or late stage, for proven founders who really have that experience and frankly need to be liberated in order to be able to spread that knowledge at a much, much wider level than just their organization. And so there are some natural allies in this space. I think it's going to be capital providers who need to have that conversation, and organizations like the Elders Council can play a very catalytic role in doing that. And usually it's very visionary funders who kind of recognize that there is a huge need here, a huge opportunity here. And it's not being addressed. It's not being addressed by the existing funding proposals that I'm seeing in the market, or I'm not aware of anything like this, even at the drawing board stage at the moment, and I think it should be.
Yeah, well, I can hear you. You're obviously very passionate about this, Martin, and great ideas. Having this kind of transition phase or retirement fund, I think is a really good idea. Just before Andrea comes in, there's a lot of kind of questions going on in the chat. I want to bring some people in now quickly. So Valeria, I saw you had a number of questions and points you wanted to make, including creating a website and so on. Why don't you kind of come in at this point and say what you think about this discussion, Valeria?
Hi, thanks for inviting me, Mel. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Thanks, Mark. That was very interesting. I mean, a lot of things come to mind because I'm a founder of social enterprises, but the social enterprise, hi Chris, I founded to date were all for profits, and now we are looking to add a non-for-profit to be able to do certain things that you can't do with a for-profit. And I'm appalled to see the rules that there are on leadership, right? That you cannot pay yourself, it's very restricted and so on, especially when you think about how it is to work with a board. And so I have had a lot of thinking of how is it that we can support that, and coaching, consulting is something that I do, and I was like, maybe I will have to develop that more. And what was written there, that we all spread too thin, I think that's Chris that said it, really resonated a lot, right? Like, it's not normal that we have to think about all the strategy that we need that we could possibly explore to be able to be sustaining ourselves to work on what we are doing and where we bring the most value to society, because we have many years and behind us working on it. So it resonates a lot. We need to find somehow a way, I think, to remove those structural barriers, right? And those cultural barriers you were mentioning that are preventing us as we do work that are very important to create system change to be able to pay ourselves, and potentially it passes through creating some shared infrastructures at the beginning before something actually enters the system, right? Where we can pool, I don't know, knowledge and resources so that we can support each other. There are some models in France I have seen, for example, there too for entrepreneurs. It's really difficult at the beginning, to be able to find a house just to rent and some, because you have to usually have full-time employment. And there are things that have been created like cooperative of some sort, and people pay something every month. And so you build a big fund, and so then you can go to a renter, and it's going to be like, okay, this rent is guaranteed by this fund that has been created by the people in this cooperative who are putting X amount of money every month. So that could be something to explore for people reaching retirement, and maybe also for the accidents during the careers, or post-COVID or whatever. And just a point on your, I don't want to take too much time, but just a point on the Web3 that you were mentioning. I think it's a good idea, but I think we're very far to be able to make that possible. We were thinking about that lately. We were just looking at the demographic of our customers and so on. Technically, it's so difficult to imagine people to download the wallet to be able to go get the token and so on. So I think there's something that we must be able to do until the technology is more user-friendly, something in between that has to be explored.
I think that's right. I'm very, very excited by the potential of Web3, but it is 5 to 10 years away. It will happen, and I think social entrepreneurs will be one of the first to sort of lead the charge on that. I'm quite sure there will be an impact coin of some kind at some stage, and that you'll start to. I'm advising. I'm talking to a number of new social entrepreneurs right now about, and actually quite a few of them, I'm recommending don't launch a for-profit or a non-profit. Launch a decentralized organization and tokenize it. But that is, but it's still very, very early days. That won't happen anytime in the next few years. So I think that, but one to watch, I think.
Okay, thanks Valeria for the contribution. We've got 2 or 3 other people want to come in now. Andrea, did you had another point you wanted to make, and then Sharath after you?
Sorry, go on, Chris.
No, I was going to say, why don't we let our other guests come in first, and then we can come in if we have time.
Totally agreed.
Yeah.
Sharath, do you want to come in with your question or your point?
Yeah, I think Mark, as always, really insightful talk, and I really agreed with the direction of it. I guess the only thing I thought a bit more deep, was thinking a lot as you were speaking, was whether, what's the core problem here? Basically, that we have a sector that's, there's always this question of the jockey or the horse, right? What's going to solve big social problems? And our mental models in our sector are entirely about getting the right horses to run around the race course. But if you talk to venture capitalists of the highest level, or any of them, it's very much a jockey mentality, that it's about getting the right leaders, and they'll find more and more solutions to the right problems over time. And so if we're in this sort of horse paradigm, which we're unfortunately stuck in, I think the big sort of insight thinking for me, and some of the work I'm doing with leaders in the sector and beyond, we don't have a great way of thinking about transitions, right? I think most motivation direction is about learning about career transitions and helping people navigate through them. So we don't have that sense of a transitional structure, and that's within the sector. But also, the thing I'm just going to add is, perhaps we should be thinking about transferable skills out of the sector as well, and a bit like a teach first type mentality, where I'm studying a world now where I'm doing things well beyond the sector, but I learned so much in the sector to take with me along that journey. How can we help leaders navigate their options through those transitions, both in the sector through some of the mechanisms you mentioned, and obviously funding and so on helps, but there's a more fundamental mental model issue, but also outside it, either to go into government or education or the private sector, whatever. Can we create that force as well? That was really the only thought I was going to add on to the really interesting points you raised.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Yeah. I think I agree with what you said, Sharath, but I think one of the challenges is that as long as there is a differential in pay between private sector and social sector, what we all see is a huge flow of talent out of the social sector, usually at about the sort of the mid-career stage. So I've seen many organizations where it's very hard to recruit people into that sort of middle management level, because a lot of the bright young people can't afford to stay on in the social sector, so they tend to leave in their late 20s. And then there's this kind of gap, so I think there are some distortions that are there, but it's certainly an interesting issue, and the idea of spending time in the social sector, but not, being able to rotate and so on, I think is really interesting. Reid Hoffman wrote a very interesting book where he talks about the idea that we should think about people think of careers as doing a tour of duty, in various areas, and I think that could be a very interesting, sort of idea to explore.
Okay, thanks. This is a really interesting space. Heike, you had your hand up. You want to ask a question or make a point? Great to hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Mark, for these interesting ideas. I really appreciate all three of them. Seeing my husband, who's going exactly that for-profit way, with at the end of his career, with the board memberships and things like that, using his knowledge, and he's always looking at what I'm doing with a different perspective on it. But especially since you said you're consulting Ashoka or working for Ashoka, that would be the first organization I would turn to, especially for the two other points you raised, the private pension scheme and even the boardships. I have been an Ashoka Fellow in Germany for, I don't know, I was elected, I think 2006, for quite some time now. And there's a few other Ashoka Fellows in Germany that are in the kind of older age group. But I have the feeling that we have a very hard time raising awareness for these kind of problems within the staff of Ashoka in Germany, because everybody who's working there is very, very young. And even if we tell them you have to think about pension already now, they look at us like, what? But for us who have been in this field for 20 years, we are now at a point where we say, well, there's not too much time we have left to think about our retirement and anything. But raising awareness within Ashoka for that topic is really hard, at least in Germany. I have no idea how it is in other countries, but that's the case in Germany. And we are kind of fighting against windmills and see it as an uphill battle. And I don't know, maybe you have a chance to raise awareness for that topic in a broader Ashoka community. I have no idea if that would be possible, but it would be helpful.
I could certainly try and make the case. I mean, in some ways, what we're talking about here is almost the anti-Ashoka, because if you think about it, right, what is Ashoka's approach? It was to provide stipends so that people could quit their corporate careers to go and become social sector founders, right, at the beginning of their careers, right? And so that has been that was the original creation of the Ashoka Fellowship, was targeted at that. And what we're talking about here is the other end of the spectrum. What we're talking about here is something that provide funding to enable somebody to quit now their social enterprise career, or at least, a particular role within that, in order to become a much more effective leader in a different sense, right? Which is spread the knowledge and do it that way. So that's quite a radical idea, because you're asking the disruptor to disrupt, its own model as well. But there could be a equally revolutionary funder to explore that idea.
Yeah, it's very interesting, this, because I think the whole notion of social entrepreneurs as a being, or as a definition, and as a social enterprise sector is relatively new. So maybe it's not surprising in a sense that this issue of kind of end of life of your career has not been looked at before. Certainly, I think Heike's point is really relevant, because certainly, I don't know about anybody else, but now when I was younger, I didn't bother about a pension, because the focus was on the cause, and I would get old one day, and that would be a long time away, and it wouldn't really matter. So actually, though, if you're looking at it as a kind of span of career from early social entrepreneur where you're supported through Ashoka to end when you're supported by Ashoka or another organization, actually makes a lot of sense, and it takes the pressure off the leader, the social entrepreneur, to sometimes stay in the organization beyond the time when they need to be there, and actually go and use and spread their skills and experiences to other organizations. So you're kind of creating win-win-wins all the way down the line by doing something like that. So I think a lot of this makes sense and resonates, and I think potentially is it's not so radical, Mark, in a sense when you start thinking about it. It seems radical, disruptors, but actually it just makes a lot of sense actually,
Yes.
in terms of its delivery. Any other points? I saw Andrea, you were making a point there in the chat just about the domination of men going on to other boards in the private sector. Do you want to make a point about women in this potential new emerging sector?
Yeah, it's just that, you know, you look at boards, even for social entrepreneurs, social entrepreneur boards are often men and not very much diversity. And it seems to be a culture that comes from the business sector. And I just want to make sure that we think very carefully about diversity on social enterprise boards, or taking up, you know, promoting diversity on, you know, if we form an organization of sort of consultancy, as Mark's suggesting, all of us to be on other people's boards, we must think about diversity and in that issue as well.
Thank you, Andrea. That's a very good point and needs to be made. And whilst Mark, I think, is correctly saying, hey, look, this is how some of the private sector behave, we don't necessarily have to copy everything it does, that's for sure. But we can apply some of the things, and that would be one of the things we wouldn't want to copy. So thank you, Andrea. I think we've got time marches on. It's incredible. And we're going to come to Chris for summing up in a moment. I see, Valeria, you have your hand up as well. So just go to you, Valeria, and then anyone else after that that's got a quick question, then we'll move on to Chris. So Valeria.
I just wanted to do a very brief comment just on what you said, Andrea. It's true, and the EU just reached an agreement, and by 2027 on corporate boards, I think there need to be a minimum of 40% women or something like that. So it's a great thing. And I wanted to say that I think that the pendant, I don't know if it's like the other side of that conversation, is that what also Mel you started to bring up is that younger like social entrepreneurs, I'm 35, for example, at the beginning of our careers, we are probably going to be like, putting money aside from the retirement and so on can wait, but then time passes, and then you have I think it's the change maker exchange or something like that, or like there is this study that just came out, and they show that there is significant delay in life's milestones in entrepreneurs between 18 and 35, because probably they show that most people are unable to pay themselves even a symbolic amount of money. And so there is something extremely important. I think this should be addressed at the same time, you know, like both like when we reach and when we start, you know, to find a way that there's never anyone who is making a choice between carrying on with developing their potential and like doing a positive impact on society, and being able to, well, take care of their well-being and that of their family and communities around them. So I don't think we should separate them.
Thank you. So we're just moving on to wrapping up. We did start a couple of minutes late, so we're going to finish a couple of minutes late. But Mark, do you have a quick couple of closing remarks, and then we're going to move on to Chris to sum up. But very grateful again for your insights and input, and indeed your great ideas. Would you have a couple of kind of concluding remarks just now?
Just to say that I think the Elders Council is playing a very interesting catalytic role in highlighting this conversation, which, you know, I haven't had before with other social sector leaders. And it's a surprise to me that it's taken this long, you know, for this topic to come up. And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's an excessive focus on people at the beginning of their careers and, you know, and the challenges of being a startup. But you know, I think it's an important conversation. It's a timely conversation, and you know, I just want to thank the people on this call for you know, for bringing together a group to talk about it. And got a few ideas. You know, I think, you know, we'll see how it develops. But something which I think is very important. So just thank you to the Elders Council for creating a forum to enable these conversations to be had.
No problem, Mark. Pleasure to hear your views. Now, quickly hand over to Chris to sum up. Thanks again, Mark. Chris.
Sure. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Mel. Mark, once again, very warm thanks on all our behalf. I think it's been a really interesting and fascinating discussion, very much as we had hoped it would be. You've emphasized essentially three major sectors which we need to think about: equity, pensions, and directorships and trustees. And the fourth one came up in the conversation, which was transitions. And I think these four are kind of the way in which we can build a framework. What you're really talking about is a change in culture. This is not, and a change in culture implies also a change in policy. And there are a number of ways in which this might be brought about. It did occur to me that the elders and your good self, maybe the social innovation circle, in fact, that we should be cooperating on some kind of thought paper coming out of this. And I'd like to put that forward as a possibility. And with Valeria here as well, we have, of course, a Catalyst that many of us are members of, as a way in which we could distribute that paper, if not wider again. And so it seems to me that that thought paper would be a kind of natural flow from the seminar that we've just held. So put that to you. We don't need to discuss it straight away, but do have a think about it. If we're looking for change, we've also had the suggestion that we could start to do this by amalgamating ideas and so on at a website level. Of course, boards are already free to take some of these ideas and interpret them at a board level, and that's important governance. And then as you go up the scale, it seems to me that at regulator level and at government level, we would then need, of course, to consider more the question of culture and policy. And so policy influencing will be at least important in some of the countries that we're working in. Britain would be an example. So it's been a very fruitful and incredibly useful webinar, and I think one that's going to have legs in the sense that we're going to be able to take these ideas and develop them further forward, which of course is ideal. Thank you for your encouragement of the elders. We really hope very much to be able to introduce idea-changing thoughts as we go through our own process. So if you are not already, do please become a member of the Elders Council or an associate. That's very easy to join, and we would welcome you to be part of that. And Heike, we would be very happy to work with you and your other fellow Ashoka fellows in Germany to have a kind of round table, just a way of discussing where we are at the moment. And we're very happy to support any particular group of social entrepreneurs in that way. So do please get in touch. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And without further ado, I think we can close the session now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye now, Valeria. Take care. Take care, Christine. Bye, Maurice. Thank you, Veronica. There we are. That's great.